Women, women, women. Some of the biggest winners in this week's midterm election are women. How will that change the face of government? Plus, changes coming to the Sedgwick County Commission with 2 new members coming on board. And we have a governor. The early results a surprise for many. What can we expect out of this next administration? That's what we're talking about right now on Kansas Week. Welcome to Kansas Week. I'm your host, Pilar Pedraza. Happy election week. I hope everyone who was eligible got the chance to vote last Tuesday. Now that we know who won, it's time to find out what it all means. Let's start with the Kansas governor's race, which made national headlines this year. National media outlets sent crews to Kansas to cover both the Laura Kelly and Chris Kobach watch parties Tuesday night. Most expected it to be hours, if not days or weeks, before we knew the winner. But by 9 p.m., national outlets had begun calling the race for Democrat Laura Kelly. She jumped out to an early 10-point lead over Chris Kobach that eventually shrank as the Republicans predicted it would, but not enough, settling at a 5-point lead, making Laura Kelly Kansas' next governor. And we've got lots to talk about today, so let's dive right in. Joining me, we have Dr. Russell Arbin Fox from Friends University. You can tell I'm excited here. I love elections. And Bob Weeks from Liberty TV. Thank you both for joining me so much. So starting with the governor's race, 5 points. A lot of people were predicting a neck and neck race where we wouldn't know the results for a week or more afterwards. What does that 5-point win tell us? Russ, let's start with you.
I think the first thing it tells us is that the strategy that was chosen by the Democratic Party to refuse to nationalize this election, to refuse to, take kind of the Trump bait that Kobach's candidacy, so often put forward, and instead focus solely on the legacy of Brownback, the legacy of the last 8 years of Republican rule, did a very good job at maintaining her Democratic base and reaching into independents, reaching into moderate Republicans and bringing them over to her. The big electoral story is probably the way Greg Orman underperformed and the way that benefited Laura Kelly.
And talking about underperforming, you're my numbers guy, Bob. You always bring me lots of numbers. I bet you've got something.
Well, nothing in real particular, except the interesting thing is that Laura Kelly won statewide as a Democrat, but all the down ballot state races, this is insurance, commissioner, attorney general, all of those were won by Republicans in fairly convincing fashion, except for Secretary of State, which was pretty close, and I think that's because the Democratic candidate had been running for a long time, was a well-known person, probably had a lot of funding as well, but also no coattails from Laura Kelly. Plus, between the primary and the general elections, the Kansas House of Representatives has taken a definite rightward shift. Some Democrats being defeated, some moderate Republicans being defeated. Most observers put it about a shift of 10 more votes into the conservative Republican category away from either moderates or Democrats.
I think that's a little misleading. I mean, the only actual change in the partisan makeup of the House is 1 vote.
Right.
Now, what you have seen were moderate Republicans being picked off by Democrats, and you have a relative shift in power overall to the conservative faction. But that doesn't mean that they necessarily have any more votes. I don't think, for example, that makes it any more likely that they would be able to prevent the Democrats from teaming with the moderates to overturn a veto if Laura Kelly were to veto something, which I think is unlikely.
Well, that's true, but I think there are fewer moderates. I mean, here in South Central Kansas, there are 4 or 5 moderate Republicans who were taken out in the primary by newcomers, to the most case, who ran on a very conservative pro-Kobach platform. So, what they actually do when they're there is another story. But and there were some notable defeats statewide. For example, in Johnson County, Melissa Rooker, a Republican, was seen as kind of a rising star on TV all the time. Moderate, very much, but she was defeated by a Democrat. Down here in Winfield, Ed Trimmer, who was noticeable, was defeated narrowly by a Republican woman, and some others like that, I think, too.
Well, we'll have to wait and see. Obviously, as you said, what they say in the campaign trail, what they do once they're in office, 2 different things. We'll have to wait and see what happens. And that's where we go with Laura Kelly, too. She's been elected. What does she do next? Laura Kelly dove right into the new job, meeting with Jeff Collier on Wednesday and the media on Thursday to discuss the transition to a new administration. This is a report I filed with Cake News. Kansas' new governor is getting straight to work, even if she won't take office for another couple months. She's got her priorities for the next 4 years.
I have not put them in numerical order yet.
Education, Medicaid expansion, rural prosperity. Most things, she says, will depend a lot on what the legislature wants to do. But one thing she can do herself, return job protections to state LGBTQ workers.
I am planning to actually have that executive order drafted before I take office so that as soon as it's possible to do that, I will reinstate that.
For now, she's concentrating on building her administration, promising to find skilled people from both sides of the aisle.
We have promised already to create an Office of Rural Prosperity, and that will be in the Lieutenant Governor's office.
She picked her Lieutenant Governor, Lynn Rogers, in part for his background as an agricultural banker. Also a former Wichita School Board member, he'll likely play a large role in any education initiatives. Another name that came up, Dwayne Goosen, a former state budget director.
We actually did meet with Jeff Collier yesterday, Governor Collier, and some of his staff, and in that meeting I did have Dwayne Goosen was with us.
What role he might eventually play? Unknown. And once again, we'd like to thank Cake News for sharing that story with us. As we look at where she's going, one thing that really stood out from that news conference as she was speaking with journalists for the first time was she continued to go back to that bipartisanship. And really, as a Democrat in, as you pointed out, the down ballot races all still pretty much staying Republican, she doesn't have much choice there. She has to be able to work across the aisle.
Mm-hmm. Have to get Republican votes, no doubt about it, in order to pass any legislation at all.
Mm-hmm. One of Orman's arguments during the campaign was that the Republicans will refuse to work with Kelly as governor, and so therefore anybody who wants change needs to vote for him. Obviously that wasn't persuasive to a lot of people. I do think that Kelly is going to have a difficult time, but she knows that. She, knew what the lay of the land was going to be. And the fortunate case is that Kansas is, like every other state, statutorily limited in the way, in the case of our balanced budget requirement in the Constitution, we're constitutionally limited in ways that the United States government is not. We can't shut down the way the United States government can. I mean, we could, but it would have all sorts of consequences above and beyond the ones that the United States government would face. Laura Kelly is going to have to position herself in such a way as to align with those constitutional requirements to force some compromises from conservative Republicans. But of course, she's also going to have to work closely with the Democrats and the moderate Republicans to make sure that they can create a unified front. There's going to be a lot of tense negotiations, but I do think that probably at least within the first year or so, she's going to be able to get some of her larger aims accomplished.
Well, coming off of that, a couple of things that I noticed was during the campaign, obviously a lot of the endorsements she had were state Republicans saying she can work across the aisle. We've worked with her before, trying to prove that point, I think perhaps battling against Orman and amongst other issues. Mm-hmm. But also, as she was talking about questions about setting up her administration, about what her plans were for this term, she was very careful not to take firm stances on anything, which to me is leaving a lot of room for that negotiation you were talking about.
Well, she took some pretty firm stances during the campaign, more spending on schools, Medicaid expansion, eliminate or reduce the sales tax on food, and do all that without raising taxes.
Yes, but the question is in the details.
Well, I think some of those details would be very, very difficult for her to negotiate around. The Medicaid expansion has been on the front burner for so many activists,
years, yeah.
Not just Democrats, but moderate Republicans as well. That everybody knows that's going to be a priority for her. Some of the other things, maybe secondary priorities, but there's a few things that we know she's basically locked into striving to accomplish. And so a lot of the fighting will be over side issues so that she can make a clear play to getting those votes together, despite the somewhat more conservative leanings in the Republican makeup of the legislature, and get it signed.
Well, and talking about the conservative leanings and the legislature, there are a lot of folks that are still very unhappy that Kelly won. Chris Kobach may have lost the race, but his campaign continued making headlines this week after a supporter jumped up on the stage during his watch party to sing about Laura Kelly dying.
Singing, this will be the day that I die. This will be the day that Laura Kelly dies.
The Topeka Capital Journal broke the story about Chris Kobach supporter Don Erbert making his displeasure with Laura Kelly known in a song Tuesday night. The speakers were turned off at the time, so only those close to the stage or with cameras hardwired to the microphones heard what he's saying. Later, the Capital Journal reports he sang a few lines from the piece Delilah. Quote, "She stood there laughing. I felt the knife in my hand, and she laughed no more." The head of the Kansas Republican Party told the paper party leadership was unaware of the singing, and that Mr. Erbert commandeering the podium was not approved by the Kansas Republican Party. Erbert already made a name for himself this election season by providing the Jeep with a mock machine gun attached that Kobach rode in several parades. Well, I know from personal experience, I was in the room as that was happening. I was at the other side of the room having discussions with party leadership. I couldn't make out what he was saying. So it doesn't surprise me that a lot of people didn't realize what was going on. But to me, it kind of speaks of some of that vitriolic divisiveness that we've seen nationwide between conservatives and moderates and liberals.
I mean, yes, there's a lot of vitriol. There's a lot of anger. There's a lot of loose talk. I don't particularly want to make too big of a deal out of any one circumstance. I mean, here you've got one sad sack guy who's, probably mildly drunk and really upset that his guy is losing, and so he decides to entertain the crowd with a bunch of bad songs. I mean, I don't know. Do you really want to take that far? There's, better things, I think, for us to be concerned about when it comes to the tension between the parties and, the level of rancor in America today.
I don't think that anybody's taking that threat literally by this person, but as a Republican, I mean, it's beyond embarrassing to me that someone would do this, that they would think that it's okay to go up on the stage and do that, drinking or not. And by the way, who just happens to have a Jeep with a replica machine gun mounted around that they, can lend to Chris Kobach to base a campaign on? I mean, I'm very firmly in favor of gun ownership rights, but it's kind of something that I prefer not to talk a lot about and not to push it out in people's face. It's rude, and I don't think it's politically effective either.
And that's a good question, is the impact on this politically. I know the Kelly campaign, when we brought it up, they didn't want to touch it. They wanted to concentrate on their message of unity.
Yeah.
She's a lot smarter than Donald Trump. Donald Trump would have been all over that, and I think Laura Kelly probably realized the Republicans are making their own stew here, so let them bake in it for a while.
I'm sure glad you said that, Bob, so I didn't have to.
All right, well, lots of things there with the governor's race, and certainly we'll be talking about Laura Kelly's administration for months to come, if not years, I'm sure. Mm-hmm. But we've got some other races to look at. The races for Congress here in Kansas had mostly expected endings, with one exception. In the first Kansas congressional district, incumbent Republican Roger Marshall jumped out to an early lead over Democrat Alan LaPolice, ending with a 36-point win and returning to Washington, D.C. for a second term. In the second district, though, an unexpected win in a tight race. Democrat Paul Davis and Republican Steve Watkins had been running neck and neck in the polls, but many expected Davis, a well-known Kansas politician, would pull out the win over Watkins, a newcomer who'd been in hot water over multiple allegations of lying about his past. But Watkins pulled off the 2-point win. In the third district, an expected upset, as Democrat Sharice Davids ousted incumbent Republican Kevin Yoder. She'd been leading Yoder by 10 points in the polls and won by 9 points Tuesday night, becoming the first gay Native American to represent Kansas in Washington. In the fourth district, Democrat James Thompson failed to repeat his performance from the 2017 special election against Ron Estes. Then, Thompson came within 6 points of Estes. Tuesday night, he fell by 20 points, sending Estes back to Congress for a second complete term. Okay, so 4 races there, 4 different congressmen and women now. What is the big headline out of those races as you look at them as a total, Russell?
So my first thought Tuesday night was that, with the exception of Sharice David's performance in the 3rd District, what you saw was what has become apparent all across the United States, which is the strong urban-rural split between Democrats and Republicans, and the fact that, James Thompson here in the 4th District, which obviously is, geographically primarily rural, but also, is the home for Wichita, the single largest city in the state. I thought that, you would have seen a little bit more movement there, but you didn't. I was later, in some discussion with some other people, and I got some pushback on that. 20 points is hardly a close race. I mean, it's a very decisive win for Estes.
It is better, though, than
but
time
right,
against
see,
Pompeo.
that's what was pointed out to me, that over the last about 7 election cycles, going back the last 15 years or so, typically the spread has been about 30 points. So, maybe that says something for how Wichita is changing. Maybe it says something about Estes and Thompson as candidates. It just maybe doesn't say quite as much as we thought it might.
Well, incumbency is pretty powerful, although it didn't work that well for Kevin Yoder up in the 3rd District. But I think the 2nd District, so that's all of eastern Kansas except for the Kansas City metro area, where Steve Watkins, the newcomer, and someone who really is quite, like you mentioned, there's so many holes in the things he was telling people, and he had this weird interview on TV one time where he thought it wasn't going to be broadcast, but it was, and there was a Republican primary with about 5 qualified candidates, qualified in the sense that they'd been state senators or the Speaker of the House. Somehow he squeaked out with about 28% of that vote, and then with the help of, I think, a very rich father, and probably the Republican Party too, was able to win that. So that's really puzzling, and I kind of felt sorry in a way for Paul Davis, but I think it is party, he said, no more races for him. So he's lost 2 big ones, governor and Congress. I don't blame him for stepping down.
I think it's entirely possible that in 2 years in the 2nd District we will once again see 2 entirely new faces. It's pretty clear that Steve Watkins actually doesn't even have the full support of his own local party.
Yeah, that was
there's
obvious
some
Tuesday
pretty
night.
There's been some, pretty shocking things that have been said by local party leaders along the lines of, well, we'll watch him for the next couple of years, and if we don't like him, we'll find someone else.
Yeah.
And that first re-election is the time they can be picked off. And I think with Ron Estes doing better than his first election, he's probably in there for at least a while.
Yeah. Well, in talking about that lack of support from the party, Watkins was about the last one to come in and give a victory speech. There was nobody left except for the people that came in with him from his party at home. There was not a lot of support as I was speaking to people at the Republican Watch Party, not leadership, but just Republicans who are at the party. There was not any love lost for him. It was, this guy bought the race. Okay, yeah, we're glad a Republican won, but they did not really like him. They didn't want to keep him.
He was the R.
Yeah, he was the R.
And in a related vein, there's the article in the Kansas City Star about the Chris Kobach campaign, where prominent Republican figures are really noting what a bad job Chris Kobach did running a campaign.
Yeah, I heard a lot of talk about that, about how unorganized his campaign was, full of hubris. There's that article in the Kansas City Star about his
even
people
had trouble
touring.
paying people, and we had trouble with him on my other TV show. He failed to show up at a time.
Really?
We waited an hour and a half. And
We've tried to invite Chris Kobach before to Friends University. He's usually taken a pass.
And he criticized the fundraising and so forth. Of course, when you have a multimillionaire running mate partner, maybe you feel you don't have to fundraise, but Chris Kobach kind of blamed a lack of money for TV advertising as a contributing factor.
Well, and certainly we know going into that last week, he had about 1/10 of the amount of money cash on hand that Laura Kelly did.
She raised a lot. Yeah.
She did. Let's not beat up on him too much, because for one thing, he's going to be around.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no reason to think that he's not going to bide his time and maybe take a run for Robert's Senate seat in a couple of years. There's any number of different options for him.
Well, he does live in the 2nd Congressional District.
That is also true.
Yeah. Well, in a conversation that I was having, and then we're going to move on because we're running out of time, but you know, the one thing about Chris Kobach is you know exactly what you're getting with him. You know, and he says that. This is what I believe. I'm not going to change that. Love it or hate it, take me or leave it.
And that was quoted in that same Kansas City Star article where you had people on his campaign who were saying, we were telling him, moderate your language in regards to school funding. It's not polling well. It's going to hurt you.
Yeah.
He said, nope. They said, moderate your language in regards to immigration issues. That's not on the radar screen for a governor. He said, nope.
Yeah, but that stick to your guns. This is what I believe, and I'm not moving. That is very Kansan, I would say, no matter what side of the aisle you're on. Okay, so looking at some other races, we'll be seeing new faces on the Sedgwick County Commission as one long-serving commissioner retires and another falls at the polls. Sedgwick County Commissioner Dave Unruh decided to retire at the end of this term, leaving his seat open. Republican Pete Meitzner, who's been on the Wichita City Council, won the seat over Democrat Renee Duxler, who, along with Lacey Cruz, ran campaigns to get younger, more diverse faces on the commission. Cruz grabbed a surprise victory over long-standing Commissioner Richard Ranzow, who'd been involved in several controversies over the last couple of years. Sitting Commissioner Jim Howell won re-election over former Commissioner Jim Skelton, who ran as an independent this year. And so that really kind of changes a little bit the dynamics that we're going to be seeing. We've seen a lot of infighting going on. Now we've got some new faces on there. That's going to change dynamics a bit.
It will. I think a lot of people, you know, both on the county commission and around the county commission are kind of holding their breath. They're waiting for the FBI to, you know, to show their cards. And frankly, when they show their cards, it may lead to yet more new faces on the county commission. You know, I think it is very likely that, you know, Michael McDonald and maybe even Howell himself might be caught up in some of this. So there's going to be more changes coming to the county commission soon, I think.
Well, and one thing that I found interesting is both Skelton and Duxler were in the 40% range and above as far as their actual final take for votes, and that indicates a pretty strong dissatisfaction with the incumbent.
I think so, and you know, I supported Renee Duxler as a Democrat, and me as a Republican. You have no idea the vitriol I've taken for that. But I looked at, you know, the Wichita economy is not thriving, and Pete Meitzner's been responsible for some of that, and he wants to continue on the same course on the county commission. I also supported Richard Ranzow, and I really think that when the dust settles out, you're going to find that the majority of three, that will be O'Donnell, David Dennis, and Dave Unruh, have done some probably illegal acts that are going to cost the county untold millions of dollars when the county councilor and county manager are fired.
Well, one of the things that Lacey Cruz was really pushing, along with Renee Duxler, is let's get some new faces, let's get some new perspectives on there, let's get some diversity on this commission. And that's certainly something we've seen nationwide as well as across Kansas with some of the candidates who've won here in Kansas and across the nation. An unprecedented number of women ran for and won offices. KSN's Sarah Berlinger takes a look at what that might mean for us.
Now tonight, celebrate. Tomorrow, let's get to work.
Lacey Cruz upset Richard Ranzow for a seat on the Sedgwick County Commission, a win other female politicians are excited about.
It's going to make a world of difference to have that perspective from a woman who has children, who has went out and met with the people.
Wow, what a night. What a night.
And Sharice Davids, a Native American and openly gay candidate, now the first of both for Kansas's 3rd congressional district. Experts say they're just a part of a bigger movement.
They're clearly engaged, paying attention to how real policies affect them, and I think that's motivated women across the country to get involved in politics.
Governor-elect Kelly says she will focus on health care and education, subjects political analyst Jeff Jarman says have been the drive behind some women's campaigns.
An issue that women clearly felt comfortable talking about and advocating for, and that translated into an increasing number of women in Kansas running for and winning office.
On a national scale, a record number of women filed to run and have been elected to Congress. And Jarman expects the number of women advocating for change to grow.
This wasn't the year of the woman as much as there will be years of women to come.
And I think that really is the big question is, well, to me, there are two big questions. One, is this a stick around change? Last time we had a year of the woman, it lasted for a term or two, and then we started to see a return to the previous dynamics, the previous demographic split. Is it going to stick around this time?
I think that there are things that are different from, the 1990s. Technology is different. You have a different sensibility, certainly within the Democratic Party and also to a limited degree within the Republican Party. Not necessarily making them any more women friendly than they were before, though obviously that is, a strong possibility, but also just the social dynamics. We're talking about the people behind the scenes. We're talking about the people who are volunteering, the people who are running campaigns, the people who are building infrastructure. There's just a lot of women involved in politics, involved in the fundraising, involved in the organizing, in a way that maybe we haven't seen as much of in the past. And so, that makes me think that, he's correct when he uses the language of years. Certainly in regards to Kansas, Sharice Davids, you can't predict the future, but, that's a district that can support a Democratic congressperson well into the future. I think Renee Dexler isn't going to disappear. I think she's going to be running for something else here in Wichita. And, she's built up a lot of cred. So, yeah, I think we'll be seeing some stuff sticking around.
And how does that change what we see coming out of government, Bob?
Well, if we had a properly limited government, not much would change, but we don't. So there will be some more changes. Women probably feel more strongly about abortion issue than men do. And issues about, for example, Ivanka Trump, she wanted the child care credits and things like that. I think today Professor Melcon gave a presentation I attended where he felt very strongly that the Women's March right after the inauguration of Donald Trump and just the misogyny and the uncouthness of Donald Trump inspired many women to think about running and to stick with it.
I'm hearing the music in my ear. We are out of time. Thank you so much, and thank you as well. Please, if you want to contact us, look for us on Twitter, KPTS Channel 8 and Pilar Pedraza TV. For now, have a great week.